All right. In my concluding remarks to you on Monday, I had been speaking about, we had started with, the whole question of racism, and then in my concluding remarks, I had tried to wrap up my discussion of nationalism, and in particular two figures, the figures of Okakura in Japan and Tagore in India. Now what I want to do today is I want to turn my attention for the most part to Russia. We haven't really looked at the history of Russia at all, and I'm going to be moving pretty much straight to the 19th century, particularly the period from 1848 onwards. And we'll then take you through the rest of the history of Russia in the 19th century and to the beginning of the 20th century. And of course, it's going to become very difficult to disentangle a number of subjects that are all related. If you look at World War I, which will be the primary subject for the lecture on Friday, along with the Great Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917, both of them, of course, have a relationship to each other. One of the things that we're going to see in World War I is the disintegration of several empires. The Ottoman Empire, we haven't talked about the Ottomans. They're going to get a mention today, and then we're going to look at the Ottomans later on as well. But it's going to lead, the end of the war is going to lead to the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire. Right, so we are going to see a fundamental rearrangement in some ways, and yet it's a familiar story because it's a story of the balance of power and all of that. But before we get to that, let's look a little bit at Russia, all right? And in particular, what I want to do is I want to begin with a discussion of the idea of Russia and the idea of Eastern Europe. Now, I had mentioned to you on a previous occasion, what do we mean by Eastern Europe? And in a very colloquial sense, I think we know what it means. It means, Russia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, and so on. And of course, a slightly more sophisticated answer would be, well, it's basically all these lands that are inhabited by people who are, for example, of Slavic origin. And now the minute you move to that definition, you begin to see that, well, maybe the difference is that it's not the Anglo-Saxons and the Teutonic people that you're talking about any longer when you're talking about Eastern Europe. Because the fundamental question is, where does Eastern Europe begin? And if you said, well, this is where you draw the line, but what really is the line? Because these are artificial lines in some sense of the term. And this is a way to make you think about the fact that Eastern Europe was in some ways an invention of Western Europe. Because when we speak about the West and we speak about Western civilization, what we really mean by that is the contributions of the Germans, the English, the French, the Italians, right? The Italian Renaissance, people like Leonardo, Michelangelo, the great painters, and so forth and so on. That's really what is usually denoted by the idea of the West. And it usually doesn't include the contributions of the Slavs. And I can tell you, so there's this wonderful, extraordinary book by Larry Wolff called The Invention of Eastern Europe, where he shows how the greatest figures of the Western Enlightenment, people like Voltaire, Diderot, in fact, thought of the Slavs as only half human. That they thought of them in exactly the same way that the English thought of the Irish, or the way in which the English and the French and the Belgians thought of the Africans, as somewhat savage, uncivilized. And so the argument of Larry Wolff in this book, The Invention of Eastern Europe, is that before Europe actually discovered and underdeveloped Africa, for example, it first underdeveloped its own people. And that Eastern Europe, in that sense, is really an invention. All right? It's a way of demarcating the Slavic people from the Teutonic people, the Anglo-Saxons, the Normans. And you do know, some of you perhaps, when we get to World War II, you know that the Nazis had as much contempt for the Slavs as they did for the Jews, which is why, of course, some of the most brutal wars and the greatest kind of brutality that was inflicted in the war was not only on the Jews, it was also on the Russians, because the Russians were viewed as people of Slavic origin. But the picture is a little more complicated. Why is it a little more complicated? Because for those of you who have an interest in these things, and even if you don't, you would have, somewhere in the back of your mind, you're remotely aware of the fact that Russia is also associated with great classical music, right? You just look at the number of musicians in the corpus of Western classical music who have come from a Russian background. People like Tchaikovsky, Prokofiev, Shostakovich. Look at literature. The greatest writers of the 19th century were the Russian novelists: Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov, Turgenev. And so what I would submit to you is this, that the way in which the West has dealt with Russia is to make a very sharp divide. That when it's a matter of Russian literature, Russian music, then the West wants to claim Russia as part of Western inheritance. But the divide is between that and the political systems of Russia, because in the West there has long been an argument for several centuries that in Russia you never had the impulse towards freedom as you did in England or America or France. That the Russians are basically an inherently despotic people, that the political systems of Russia have always tended towards despotism, authoritarianism, totalitarianism. And so that part of Russia, viewed in the political sense, is Oriental. Because, you know, Russia straddles Asia and Europe. And there's always been this complicated question in the Western imagination, how to deal with Russia. It's a question that continues down into 2019, as we know, in 2019. And for every American president over the course of the last 70 years, particularly after the end of World War II, when the Soviet Union emerged as the other great power, the question was, how does one think of the Soviet Union, or what is now Russia, and what had been Russia, except for that interim period of 70 years when it was the Soviet Union. Right? And what I'm suggesting here, this is, in fact, this is a very short, cryptic way of thinking about it, but this is how the West has essentially dealt with it, that when it looks at the political systems of Russia, it says that, well, Russia is inherently an Oriental country. There is no impulse towards freedom. The individual doesn't exist in this society. Their collectivity is labor has never been free, so forth, so on and so forth. But then when you look at the great Russian cultural inheritance, then yes, Russia is part of the West. All right? So this is, I think, how you should begin to think of locating Russia in the 19th century and moving into our times. Right? And there was a Russian empire which goes back to the early 1600s, as this map shows you, and you can see, of course, Russia is still the most enormous landmass that you have. It's a massive empire, and at that time, of course, there were, in the early 1600s, there were other empires too. There was the Chinese, and of course, there was a great Mughal empire. You had the Ottomans. And what we're going to see, of course, this map doesn't show it to you, but is the expansion of Russian territorial ambitions. All right? Now, what I'd like to do is, I'd like to move into a brief discussion of Russia in the 19th century. All right? And when I say liminal position, that's what I've been discussing. That is that it's on the cusp. It's Asian, it's European, it's Oriental, it's Occidental. It's hard to locate it in the Western imagination, except in the way in which I have suggested to you. All right? Now, the opening up of Russia to the West, of course, takes place several centuries earlier. That's not really part of our purview here. And that is, of course, a story of, you know, Peter the Great. And for at least several decades, so in fact, you could say for maybe half a century after that, Russia continued to open itself up to the West in various ways. In the early 1800s, you have the Napoleonic Wars, and you have Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. And you know, when there's an invasion of that kind, it always leads to, of course, a reaction, a nationalist reaction, a kind of what you might say insularity. And there's been a long discussion about what you might describe as the Russian national character, all right? And one of the interesting ways to look at it is to see how Russia positioned itself in the first half of the 19th century in various kinds of debates. So, for example, the Russians were crucial in the suppression of the Polish rebellion of 1830-31. You know, Poland, again, long, checkered, complicated history. One could do a whole course around Poland and its various partitions over the course of the last 3 centuries. Of course, it gets absorbed by the Nazis immediately after the onset of World War II. Poland is one of the first areas that they conquer. It becomes what's called a general government. And I can mention to you right now something for you to think about, but the vast majority of concentration camps that were set up by the Nazis, most people have only heard of Auschwitz or Dachau. It's actually over 500 camps. Over 500 camps. Some of them were extermination camps, some of them were not extermination camps. We'll get to that in much greater detail in a couple of weeks. But the vast majority of them were in Poland. Right? And that again tells you how the Germans are thinking. One of the reasons they're in Poland is not only because there's a very large concentration of Jews living in what was then Poland, but also because the idea was that the Polish Jews, you know, they're the most contemptible of all the Jews because they're Jews and then they have this Slavic influence, right? So this is one reason why Poland in particular received the brunt of Nazi oppression in many ways. But if you go back to the first half of the 19th century, what we also find is that Russia is supporting the Greek Wars of Independence. One of the greatest of the English Romantic poets, Byron, was a great supporter of these movements. And then you think to yourself, well, why is Russia, which is a country which, at least on the Western narrative, has no impulse towards freedom, where its own people are not free? Because what was a characteristic nature of Russian society in the mid-19th century? In fact, the bulk of the 19th century, that it's a predominantly, profoundly agricultural society based on serf labor, right? Now, if that's the case, then why would the Greek Wars of Independence be supported by the Russians in the 1820s? And one of the reasons for that is because, of course, the Russians are already locked into battle with the Ottomans, right? And the Greek Wars of Independence are an attempt on the part of the Greeks to escape the stranglehold of the Ottoman Empire. So this is one reason why Russia is supporting it. And that is characteristically how one looks at this kind of history, that there's always a balance of power. There are countries that are supporting each other or nations that are supporting each other, not for intrinsic moral reasons or because they necessarily, you know, think that the aspiration of these people to freedom is to be supported. I mean, if anyone here thought that, oh, the Americans were supporting, you know, Iraq, the rebellion in Iraq against Saddam Hussein because the Americans love the idea of Iraqis aspiring for freedom, well, that's completely nonsense. You know, these are their national self-interests that countries have. And this is essentially what's really happening over here. Now, one of the ways in which one can look at it, and again, I do it with some degree of hesitation because we shouldn't be looking only at wars, but what is also interesting is how much of the political history is really all concentrated around wars for supremacy. You know, you look at World War I and then you think of the great war, you know, for balance of power within Europe itself. But there's a long, complicated history, some segments of which you've already seen. For example, in the book Exterminate All the Brutes, and that is the history of colonial wars. You know, for example, the Boer War, which I want to mention at this moment, just so that you get a sense of what I mean by these colonial wars. You already read about the Central African Expedition, for example. But that's not a war on the scale that I'm thinking about. What is the Boer War? The Boer War is fought from 1898 until 1901, 1902. And where is it fought? It's fought in what is now South Africa. But at that point, South Africa was not a union. You had various provinces. So the main provinces were the Orange Free State, and Cape Town, Natal, for example. All right? And what you have is you have two major European populations there, in addition to, of course, the bulk of the people who are African. But if you're looking at the European populations, you're talking about the English and you're talking about the Boers or the Dutch. And this is going to be a war fought in 1898, and one of the reasons it's exceedingly important in comparison to other colonial wars is that the concentration camp, which we think of again as something that is a history going to the Nazis. Right? If the minute I mention concentration camp, most people will think about the particular ways in which Jews were brought into these camps, and then, you know, some of them were sent to extermination camps, some of them were sent to labor camps, and some of the concentration camps were, of course, both, right? Not simply points where you brought people together. But the history of the concentration camp goes back to the Boer War. Because one of the ways in which the English attempted to procure their domination in this region was they rounded up the Boers in the Transvaal. Right? So that's the other fourth major region there in the Transvaal. The Transvaal is a very big area, and the Boer population is scattered, and they know that these Boers living in the rural countryside are waging guerrilla wars against English forces. So what do? They gather all of these people and they bring them to certain designated areas. These are concentration camps, barbed wire, watch guards, German shepherd dogs, to ensure that no one flees. And of course the conditions were horrible in these concentration camps. Right? So many of the ideas that are going to be tested out later on, many of the experiments that are going to be conducted against the Slavs, against the Jews, including medical experiments, you know, many of these are first carried out against colonized people in places such as Africa and Asia. All right? Now, if you go back to the mid-19th century, so I was talking about the fact that once again we are looking at a war here, but I'm looking at the Crimean War in particular because it's a way for me to introduce, one, the Ottomans into the picture, and secondly, because thus far, when we've been looking at major figures, we haven't seen the emergence of what we might describe as a woman in the singular. What is the place of women in history? Right?
Teachers, mothers.
Right, right. So where do they come into the picture? And you know, again, if you're looking at, let's say, the pre-modern period, then you know you invoke figures such as, let's say, Joan of Arc or Elizabeth, right? Elizabeth I, the Queen of England, under whom the charter was given to the East India Company in 1600. Right? And then, of course, you have figures such as Catherine the Great. So we notice, by the way, that even the women who generally are invoked in these history are either martyrs or monarchs. Right? So now we have an interesting figure who's going to make an appearance during the occasion of the Crimean War. And that's one reason I want to look at this particular war. And just so that you have an idea of what area we're talking about, so here we're talking about the Black Sea over here. Okay, and so you can see the little inset, it says Southwest Crimea. This is the area that we're talking about. And here's the Crimean Peninsula, so there's another satellite map here, Russia, Ukraine on the top, right? This is, and this is, of course, the blue here, this is the Black Sea that we're talking about, right? Okay, so what was the occasion for it? The Tsar in Russia is Nicholas I. He claims that he is the guardian of Christian interests in the Holy Land, all right? And when we say the Holy Land, we're talking about, of course, Israel, Palestine, Jerusalem, all of that, which is under the control of the Ottomans, you know. Now, Britain and France, in turn, claim to support the Catholics, and they give their support to the Ottomans. So what's really going to happen is that you're going to have an opposition of the Russians versus the Ottomans. The Ottomans are going to be, if you're thinking about, if you want another word for the Ottomans, Turks, all right? I mean, that's the simplest way to think of it, right? And the backdrop to this is that the Ottoman Empire is already beginning to, in a way, disintegrate. Very slowly, there are pressures. For example, I've given you an instance of that already, the Greek Wars of Independence. All right? But before I get further into the Crimean War, let me say something about the Ottoman Empire at this juncture. And I want to do that by showing you a slide of a place called Thessalonica. All right? So if you look at this slide over here, this is the place that I want to mention to you. So you know Macedonia, this is Greece, right? Okay? And this was all part at one point of the Ottoman Empire. And here you see, of course, Asia to the east and the Aegean Sea. Now, Thessalonica, also known as Salonica in short, has really an extraordinary history. And there's a book that I'm going to recommend by Mark Mazower, M-A-Z-O-W-E-R. Okay, it's a history of Thessalonica. So it's a largely Orthodox Greek city on the Aegean Sea. As you can see, that's the Aegean Sea over here. All right. Now, for close to 5 centuries, from 1430 to 1912, it was under Ottoman rule, Thessalonica. It was a place which had a very substantial population of Jews as well. In fact, when the Jews fled persecution in Spain in 1492, so you know 1492 is a pivotal year. It's the expulsion of the Jews and the expulsion of the Moors, the Muslims, and of course you have Columbus and all of that, right? So it's really, it inaugurates a new era, you might say, all right? So the Jews who were fleeing persecution in Spain, one of the places they went to was Thessalonica. Why did they go there? Because it already had a considerable reputation as a place of hospitality. Hospitality to the other, the stranger, the foreigner, the refugee, the exile. And throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, what do you see? You see Turks, Greeks, Albanians, Bulgarians, Serbs, large number of communities all dwelling there, inhabiting the same space. Right? And on the same street, you would see a mosque, you'd see a Roman Catholic church, you'd see a Greek Orthodox church, a Syrian Orthodox church, a synagogue, right next to each other. Right? That was Salonica. Now, the most interesting part, all this is extraordinary already because you have to think about a place that's really ecumenical, and what I'm saying is that in some ways, empires have always been much more open. You know, I am not suggesting for a moment that the Ottoman Empire was a complete paradise of hospitality and tolerance, but there is absolutely no question in my mind, based on the reading that I've done and my general understanding, that you do not have in the Ottoman Empire the kind of vicious, for example, anti-Semitism that was really extremely common all over Western Europe. You simply don't have it. And the most extraordinary part of this story is that when the Nazis take over, when they come in, right, what do they find? They come there and they say to the town leaders, where is the Jewish ghetto? This is completely from Mark Mazower's history. They say, where is the Jewish ghetto? And the residents of Thessalonica or Salonica say, well, what do you mean by a Jewish ghetto? And the Nazi commander is just absolutely flabbergasted because he says the Jews ought to be in a ghetto, because that was typically where Jews lived in Western European communities, in ghettos. But there was no ghetto in Thessalonica. Right? You understand the point, right? So the Nazi commander writes a letter back home to his superiors in Berlin, and you can just read the disappointment, the shock on his face, as it were, because he cannot find a Jewish ghetto, and he thinks that this is absurd. Because what does he say? He says, for the average Greek, there is no Jewish question. He does not see the political danger of world Jewry. End quote. The Greek is a stupid peasant. He doesn't understand that the Jews are a danger to the world. And if he did, he would put them in a ghetto. Right? So you see, this is a way of entering into the history of the Ottoman Empire in many ways. And when we're looking at the conflict here in the Crimean War, we're saying that, in a sense, this is a very good illustration of where these considerations were not primary at all. Nobody is thinking of what people are really thinking about is we're thinking about national self-interest and how do you position yourself in what is clearly becoming now an extremely volatile world, because old empires are already, this is 60 years before World War I. That's what I'm suggesting to you, that old empires are already beginning to show the strain, and they're beginning to crumble in many ways. So this Crimean War, it breaks out between Russia and the Ottomans, and the Ottomans are going to be supported by Britain and France. The war is fought on the Black Sea. You have heavy casualties on both sides. 250,000 people are believed, soldiers are believed to have been killed on both sides each, right? And there's an initial Ottoman defeat, but eventually Russia is going to lose to an alliance of the Ottoman Empire, Britain and France. One of the reasons why that happens is because, of course, by this point in time, the British in particular have a much more superior army, all right? Now, we need to understand a little bit more about what's transpiring there, a different aspect of this history, a social aspect of this history, in order to understand the emergence of Florence Nightingale, right? So that's one of the other reasons why I wanted to look at the Crimean War, all right? You know, when Britain and France enter into this conflict in 1854, they expect a swift victory. The British have long-range ships, they have much better artillery, and of course Britain had now, this was 100 years into the Industrial Revolution. Britain is a major industrial power. It simply has a kind of an industrial advantage, certainly over Russia. Russia was no match in that sense of the term, right? But when they enter into this war, they expect that this is going to be concluded over the summer of 1854. So they're not preparing for a winter, right? And the troops are very lightly clad, they're housed in tents, but the war actually drags on for much longer than they had expected, moves into the winter of 1854-55, and then the military historians have told us why that happened, a series of strategic errors in planning the war, in providing military relief, so forth and so on. And the entire British fleet, or a good portion of it, is actually going to be destroyed in a winter storm, right? And the supplies are also going to thin out. So this is the context. Eventually they're going to recover ground, but what's going to happen is that you have these troops who are housed in extraordinarily poor circumstances. You've got shortages of food. You don't have proper sanitation, for example, right? And the hospitals themselves are actually going to be sites of disease. You know that this is also the problem with modern hospitals, that if you stay too long in a hospital, it's quite likely you can pick up an infection there, right? And the situation in the mid-19th century in this kind of situation is much worse. There's very little water. The water is very often contaminated. The food is putrid. And you have typhus, cholera, and dysentery. Right? Large number of people are going to fall ill and die simply from these diseases. It's in the midst of this that Florence Nightingale is going to emerge, and she is important because the idea of modern nursing goes back to Florence Nightingale. Right? Now, she's a very complicated woman. She in her own way, she had, by the way, some undoubtedly racist sentiments. I can tell you that. You can look at her scattered writings on, the English in India and all of that. So I'm not trying to make a saint out of her, not even remotely. What I'm interested in is simply the fact that, well, what you have is we have a woman now who emerges from the pages of history, who's not a monarch, who's not a martyr in the ordinary sense of the term. She is, of course, a martyr because she works in these extremely difficult, filthy circumstances, nursing and trains women, and then they, of course, provide relief, and they nurse the soldiers back to health to the degree that they can, right? And so this is who I'm speaking about. Mid-19th century women like her always looked very stern, extremely stern and forbidding, as did the men, right? But you can see from this photograph, and by this point in time, once again, let me remind you, photography is now very much already part of the imagination of the imaginary of the modern, right? And here is another painting there where you can see here a much more idealized representation. This is a painting, of course, not a photograph, and you can see the Union Jack back there. So, tending to the wounded in the middle of the night with the lamp, and that was the typical representation of Florence Nightingale. But we have to do a little bit extrapolation there, because you also have to think, since we're interested in the modern world in this course, why is it that and I'm not going to answer these questions, I'm just posing them for you, why is it and under what circumstances is it that certain professions, for example, became extremely feminized, right? Nursing is a very good illustration of that. Because, of course, there were certain assumptions that women are more nurturing, they're more caring, so forth and so on. And this is what this you could say was one of the reasons why a profession such as nursing became feminized almost from the beginning. Almost from the beginning. There have been male nurses, certainly, but from the beginning. And the fact that it became feminized and was associated with the idea of women being nurturing and caring is picked up by a number of men who, in some ways, are trying to feminize politics. And the best example of that, when we come to the last part of the course, will be someone like Gandhi, who, of course, is in many ways recognized as the great architect of the idea of nonviolence. But if you read biographies of Gandhi, you find out that he spent a lot of time nursing people, right? Nursing lepers, nursing the wounded, the sick, so forth and so on. And so this is where, even though you can say that, we're looking at Florence Nightingale because she's emerging from the pages of history, there's a woman now here, and this is the birth of modern nursing, but then there are implications that continue down to the present day, all right? Now, if I can just, let me go back to the slides over here. So, where we're here at this point in the mid 1850s, and recall what I've said to you, that the Crimean War is going to end with a crushing defeat for Russia. And shortly thereafter that, you're going to have the elimination of serfdom in Russia by Alexander II. And in order to understand that, just keep in mind, compare the other contexts in which you have had the elimination of serfdom, or more broadly, what you can describe as unfree labor. Right? So one way in which we can think about the advent of modernity here is the constant struggle against unfree labor in many parts of the world. In France, you have the abolition of serfdom, of course, with the French Revolution. In Poland and Hungary, with the revolutions of 1848. I had mentioned to you that the 1848 revolutions had been largely unsuccessful, but there had been a few instances in which they had actually brought out some desirable end. And one of those was that in some portions of what is called Eastern Europe, in Poland and Hungary, you have the abolition of serfdom, at least officially in 1848. And of course, in the United States, you have the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1st, 1863. All right? These slides will be made available to you later on. Gives a few more details about the Crimean War. Now, as we move into the second half of the 19th century, looking at the history of Russia, we have to think about Russian expansion. And all of this is, of course, going to lead to eventually various other kinds of conflicts, including the great Russo-Japan War of 1905. The Trans-Siberian Railroad had been completed towards the end of the 1880s. What it did was it connected Russia with the European part of Russia with the Pacific. You have a considerable boom now moving into the 1870s, 80s, 90s in Russian industry, in the coal and iron sectors. Export of grain from Russia is going to increase. Potato I gave you a social history of the potato previously. The potato crop is going to be grown much more extensively, and Russia is going to seek to expand its influence in Central Asia. This is what is called the Great Game. If anyone here has ever read that great novel by Kipling called Kim, it's about the Great Game. What is the Great Game? It is Russia and Great Britain jockeying for power in Central Asia, in that area which is now occupied by countries such as Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and of course portions of Afghanistan as well. And the Great Game was of great concern to the British in India, because of course this is the region which is to the west of India itself. So there were obvious repercussions and implications if this territory should pass under Russian control. As we move into the last decade of the 19th century in Russia, what we're going to see is considerable improvements in the banking system, attempts to bring in Western investors, a story which still, of course, continues in many parts of the world, to see if they would pour money into Russia and help in obviously bringing forth new industries, right? And by around 1900, half of Russia's industries are actually foreign owned. But you can see that there's been considerable industrialization, because Russia around 1900 is fourth in the world in steel production. If you go back 50 years ago, it would have been nowhere near the top, right? And it's second in petroleum production and refining. In 1900, which was the power, the world power, it wasn't recognized officially as a world power, but it really was a world power. Which country was the first in petroleum production and refining? The United States, right? And so Russia is the second around 1900. There is at the same time a great demand for reforms, liberal reforms, all right? And this is what I mean by the demand. This is what is meant in the slide here, demand from the intelligentsia for liberal reforms, because Russia is still under Tsarist rule. It's an autocratic system. There is no such thing as freedom of speech for the most part. And one of the ways in which people responded when they didn't have access to these kinds of avenues, right, for expressing themselves that you find in liberal democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, print media, so forth and so on, what you find is the rise of political anarchism. And what is now called anarchism in the political sense of the term, its history goes back to the 1880s to Russia. So targeted assassination of political leaders, or in this case the Tsar, the Alexander II, the Tsar is going to get assassinated in 1881, but that's what these anarchists did. So so you can describe this as urban guerrilla warfare. Right? We talked about guerrilla warfare in colonial wars when you have asymmetrical warfare. Now here we're talking about actually urban guerrilla warfare, because these anarchists are small groups of people with extreme political views who are trying to destabilize the political situation. They're of course thinking of it as a way to create the space for certain kinds of demands, including, as I said, the demand for freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of political association. Right? So the birth of anarchism can be traced to Russia at this point in time. Right? Now there is also an expansion, and this, so this slide over here, the slide is in the wrong place here, but here you see the advent of railways. Right? So by the late 19th century, the number of countries now have fairly extensive systems, including the United States, and you see the Trans-Siberian Railroad here from St. Petersburg and Moscow going all the way to Manchuria over here. And you can see that the Chinese, the southern Manchurian Railroad lines, right? So what we are seeing here is a considerable expansion by Russia, and this is what I meant. One of the things that the Trans-Siberian Railroad did was it connected St. Petersburg and Moscow, which are considerably to the west, right, to the Pacific Ocean. And of course, Japan Japan is right over here. Japan itself is now, as we saw in a previous lecture, it is on the verge of expansion. They've gone through the Meiji Restoration. They've gone through all of these reforms that basically Russia is going through, let's say, about 3 to 4 decades later. And this is going to eventually lead to a conflict, and this is the conflict in 1905, what is called the Russo-Japan War of 1905. I want to linger over this war for just a few minutes, not its military aspects even remotely, but I want to linger on its symbolic and cultural significance. Okay? Recall, and this is a way to link what I'm saying now with what I've been speaking to you about in the previous lecture. I'm speaking to you about Tagore, about Okakura, Pan-Asianism, the renaissance of Asia, the revival of Asia, and the great centers within Asia. Right? In 1905, when this war takes place, it's going to end with another crushing defeat for Russia. All right? Japan's going to emerge triumphant. And I can tell you, if you read Jawaharlal Nehru, his autobiography, he's a young boy at that time. But he realizes the significance. What is the significance? That this is the first time that a modern Asian nation has inflicted a defeat on a European power. From their standpoint, Russia is a European power. And the news of this triumph is going to reverberate throughout Asia. I mean, if you read Ho Chi Minh, right, the great leader of the anti-colonial movement in Vietnam, and the person who's going to inspire, of course, the whole resistance to the French and then subsequently the Americans, the Vietnam War, right? The great inspirational figure there, in a sense. If you read Ho Chi Minh, again, he talks about the importance of 1905. And even someone who is not even a party to this, and here I'm thinking of the great African-American intellectual, W.E.B. Du Bois. He writes a whole essay. He's living in the United States, and in 1906, early 1906, he writes an essay where he says that this war and its outcome is going to possibly determine the future of world history, right? Because what does he see? He sees exactly what all the great Asian leaders saw, the emergence of Asia, right? But there's no, at this point, there's no intrinsic criticism of the concept of militarism. You know, subsequently, people like Du Bois and Nehru, and of course Gandhi principally, are going to have a whole critique of the whole concept of militarism. But at this point, what they're seeing is that, you know, for the first time in centuries, there is an Asian power which has now inflicted defeat on a European power. This signifies the emergence of Asia as a force in world history. Right? So you can look at Vietnam, you can look at India, and obviously Japan itself, because Japan was a triumphant party. You can look at China. You can look at what Mao says about this war. No matter what part of Asia you went to, this war became a war that signified a huge difference in the fortunes of Asia and the world. All right? Now there are consequences of a different kind in Russia. Because what's been happening in Russia, of course, thus far, right, is, as I've described to you, you've got the elimination of serfdom in 1861, but on the whole, conditions haven't really improved. And there is a demand by the liberal intelligentsia beginning in the late 1870s, 1880s, 1890s for certain kinds of reforms. You've got political anarchism on the rise, and then, of course, Russia suffers its defeat in 1905. So there are going to be quite a lot of agitations. One of the ways in which you can track the history of what's happening in Russia is to look at the increase in the number of strikes. All right, you know, what kind of strikes are taking place? How frequently are they taking place? And before I get to that, I want to just turn your attention just momentarily here to a set of postcards just a couple of them, because it also shows you a couple of different things. It shows you the alliances that are forging around here. It also shows you what I'm going to describe. You remember that I've spoken to you about photography and pamphlets and cartoons. Right? So, for example, one of the questions that you could possibly get, just hypothetically, on your final exam is, take two of these print medias. Take cartooning, photography, okay, pamphlets, and postcards, to try to understand how a certain kind of public sphere was emerging. How was public opinion being forged? How do countries try to influence their subjects and other countries to believe their narrative of what happened? You know, there's a word in English, it's called propaganda. But it's not just propaganda. These are forms of symbolic and cultural capital that countries have. And postcards was one of the most common ways in which certain notions of culture were diffused all over the world. All right? So here's a German postcard, which combines this map. So it uses the art of cartography with what you might call a kind of a humorous commentary on the strategic alliances that lie behind the war. So if you look at this bear, you know what the bear always represents? Russia, the Russian bear, you know, right? And if you look at its tail over here and you look at its head, you see a French hat, okay, a French hat. Right? So this, of course, suggests that there is an alliance between Russia and France, right? That France was backing up Russia. And if you look at Japan over here, and of course it's represented by the figure of a Japanese woman with a folding fan and a kimono, and behind her, what do you see? You see Britain, a man who represents Britain, and he's got a warship on his head, right? So it's of course quite a funny cartoon, but what it's also showing is the alliance between Germany and France, and then versus Japan versus England. And here again, once again, we see that the countries that are going to fall behind other countries. And again, this has nothing to do with moral positions, although countries very often claim that they're staking moral positions. It simply has to do with the idea of national self-interest and then trying to understand what is the balance of power that you want to achieve, right? How can you claim the most strategic advantage from a certain set of circumstances? And here you have another postcard, which once again here you have the Russian bear, but instead of having simply a hat on the tail, what you have is Joan of Arc, probably the most well-known representative of France. But here, just to make sure that people understood, they put France here at the bottom, and then you have Japan over here, and you have Angleterre, that's England. And what the postcard here is suggesting is the spoils of war, that there is massive, devastation on both sides, lives that are lost. And so what you see here is you see vultures which are kind of feasting on what you might call the remains. All right, so this is, and it's a whole set of postcards. I mean, there were hundreds of postcards that were released at this time. And the Japanese, by the way, are introducing postcards as well. These are in the form, the art that is used here is a woodblock print. So you know that there are these extraordinary Japanese artists from the 19th century who became the master of the woodblock print. You've seen Hiroshige's Great Wave, one of the most famous representations in the history of art. So I won't discuss these in great detail, but I'm bringing this as a little interlude so that you can now understand the advent of if I may put it this way, a new kind of technology, right? But very quickly, in a minute or two, before we wrap up, so I'm saying that in 1905 you have this war that leads to defeat for Russia. There's going to be a greater agitation for demands. The strikes are going to increase very considerably. That indicates workers' unrest, peasants. And in 1905, you're going to have the first of the three revolutions in Russia. There are three revolutions, 1905, February 1917, and then, of course, a revolution that most people know about, which is the Bolshevik Revolution. And what's going to happen is that this Revolution of 1905, they're going to actually introduce a notion of parliamentary freedom to some degree, but basically the Duma, which is the parliament, its ability to do anything to the Tsar is going to be greatly restricted. So the Tsar is still in power in 1917, right? We stop here.